In the life of many great artists, there has been one significant meeting which has changed the course of the rest of their personal and artistic lives. In the case of Van Dyck, this fatal encounter was with Rubens, who also painted this youthful portrait. The great Flemish artist was to become an enormous, even invasive presence in Van Dyck's life and an inevitable influence on his work. Van Dyck was born into a rich family of silk merchants in Antwerp in 1599. Antwerp was an important port on the Scheldt at that time, although it was heading towards decline. The religious wars, with the revolt of the Protestant provinces and the horrors of the Inquisition, had abruptly halted the development started at the end of the 1400s. At that time, Antwerp was the largest of the Flemish ports, larger even than Bruges, and the center of English textile exports to Central Europe. It was still a rich city, however, and continued to trade very profitably with countries allied to Spain, such as the Republic of Genoa, which also opened numerous banks and trade centers there. Thanks to this very healthy economy, the city continued to enjoy a lively artistic life in the first decades of the 1600s. Van Dyck's great talent became apparent at a very early age. He was apprenticed at age 11 to Hendrik van Balen, a painter who had worked in Italy and who had passed his love of Italian Renaissance painting on to his young pupil. The young Van Dyck was a fast learner, and at just 14 years old, he completed his wonderful portrait of an old man. Van Balen had awoken his passion for color and for Titian, who was considered a model. Anton may have first met Rubens when he opened his own studio in Antwerp at just 16. It is known that he became Rubens' pupil and collaborator in his crucial formative years between 1618 and 1621. Peter Paul Rubens, at just over 40, was then Europe's most celebrated artist. At home, he was not only adored by the members of high society who sat for his portraits, but also by the Catholic Church, which used his highly communicative, triumphant art to assert its doctrines in an area bordering the Dutch provinces which had converted to Protestantism. Rubens' fame was confirmed on his return from Italy in 1610, when his two exuberant and visionary triptychs, The Raising of the Cross and The Deposition from the Cross, were hung in the city's cathedral. The triptychs preempted the Baroque movement, which was still in its infancy, and were heavily influenced by elements of great Italian Renaissance painting and Caravaggio's realism. Van Dyck used to work at Rubens' wonderful home, which also housed his studio. He had had the house built using the money he'd earned during his time in Italy, where he not only painted, but carried out cultural and diplomatic duties. The house was a complete novelty for the Flemish, inspired as it was by Italian Renaissance palazzi. It appears in Van Dyck's famous portrait of Rubens' first wife, Isabella Brandt, daughter of an important humanist. Rubens received collectors at his home and sold them paintings from Italy and other European countries. He had several painters working with him in his studio, each specialized in a particular genre, such as still life or animals. These helped him meet the great demand from collectors for his work. Van Dyck learnt an enormous amount during his 4 years in Rubens' studio. His touch can be seen in the cartoons for the tapestries which tell the Storia di Decio Mure, the tales of a Roman consul who, according to legend, sacrificed himself to the gods to ensure his army's victory in battle. The cartoons were commissioned by the Pallavicinis, a Genoese family living in Antwerp at the time. Van Dyck was no ordinary pupil, however. In fact, it is said that his name was clearly mentioned by Rubens in contracts with certain customers. Several paintings on the ceiling of the Jesuit church in Antwerp, designed by Rubens but executed by Van Dyck, were destroyed during a fire there in the 1770s. During his time with Rubens, Van Dyck followed his master's style. However, when the two painted different works on the same theme, as happened with the Drunken Silenus, the young painter did show some developments of his own. His brushwork is more nervous and vibrant, and he toned down Rubens' monumentality with more fluid, fiery figures. The proof that Van Dyck's talent had been fully recognized in his native land came in 1620, when he was asked to paint a scene from the Mysteries of the Rosary series at the city's Dominican church. Other painters involved in the project included his old master, Van Balen, Cornelis de Vos, his fellow student, Jordans, and Rubens himself. His Road to Calvary is a sort of homage to Rubens' incredible virtuosity, to which it seems Van Dyck returned at a time when he had perhaps decided to take a different direction and find himself. However, as a reaction against such pomposity and monumentality, Van Dyck quickly became attracted to portraiture, which in many respects was a more marginal genre. Even in his earliest portraits, such as that of his painter friend Snyder with his wife, and Susanna Formant with her daughter, Van Dyck showed a great ability to reveal something of the secret inner side of his sitters. More important still, perhaps, was the intellectual and aristocratic elegance of the ambiences he created around his subjects. In 1621, after a brief stay in London, Van Dyck decided to travel to Italy to see the Renaissance painting he had heard so much of from his masters in person. He decided to settle in Genoa, a powerful, ambitious city, famous from the days of the Crusades for its great wealth and trade with the East. Genoa had been dominated by its aristocracy, and they usually kept to their own quarters, which were a little like fortified islands dotted along the streets leading to the port and the markets. But as Van Dyck arrived, the city was undergoing a period of transformation and had already grown into an important European city. Andrea Doria was then Genoa's most important citizen. He had made his fortune by arranging an alliance in 1528 between the city and the Spain of King Charles V. King Charles was himself a rich man from the conquests made for him by yet another Genoese. Doria built a palace for himself by the sea in Fasolo, just west of the city. The palace rivaled any of the Medici villas in the beauty of its gardens and fountains, the elegance of its arcades, and its rich, light-filled rooms. He commissioned Perin del Vaga, who had worked on the Vatican frescoes with Raphael, to complete the house with a series of frescoes. The high Genoese aristocracy were infected by the old patriarch's example, and the house became the symbol of noble status. In the second half of the 1500s, a huge new street, the Via Aurea, or Strada Nuova, was built. Old narrow streets and buildings were demolished to make way for it, and fashionable architects were called in to design its sumptuous residences. Among these were Bernardino Cantone and Giovan Battista Castello, the Bergamasco, who introduced Baldassare Peruzzi's Roman Renaissance architecture to Genoa. Space, in a city caught between mountain and sea, became a luxury. A whole new art market was born, and Tuscan, Lombard and Flemish artists all competed for commissions from the important Genoese families. The quality of local artists improved too. The ceilings of the city's palazzi glowed with mythical and biblical stories, metaphors for triumphs of the families, sometimes illustrated with a bit of artistic license. This started another fashion. Some Genoese noblemen began collecting paintings on canvas and on wood too, and collections of great size and merit grew in the Ligurian city. An aristocracy so obsessed with image was a godsend to a portraitist such as Van Dyck. While in Genoa, he stayed with two fellow painters from Antwerp, the brothers Lucas and Cornelius de Weil, depicted here in one of his portraits done as a gift to his friends for their hospitality. He may have lived in a house on the Salita Santa Caterina, not far from the Strada Nuova. Van Dyck left Antwerp to free himself from the clutches of his master's powerful personality, but even abroad he seemed to follow in his footsteps. Rubens had spent quite a lot of time in Genoa during his trip to Italy. He had painted many portraits there, as well as the circumcision for the Church of Jesus. Later he sent the miracle of Saint Ignatius back to Genoa for the same church from his workshop in Antwerp, so leaving the city with two perfect masterpieces. The Brignole Sale family moved to the Palazzo Rosso, the newest building on the Strada Nuova, in 1677. They had only recently risen to the rank of Doge, and their house on the Piazza degli Embriachi no longer befitted their new status in society. The only complete set of family paintings done by Van Dyck in Genoa survives in the splendid reception rooms of their house on the Strada Nuova. Geronima Sale, wife of Gio Francesco Brignole, is painted alongside her daughter Aurelia. The sumptuousness of the silver and gold brocade on the child's dress seems to lighten her mother's more austere outfit. Paolina Adorno, the young daughter-in-law to the family, poses beside a balcony in a richly decorated Spanish-style dress. Her gold-decorated bodice and tiara give the idea of refinement and pomp. The red of the furnishings and the parrot suggest the young girl's youthful satisfaction. However, Paulina's image contrasts sharply with that of her husband, seen here on horseback. His clothes are severe and his expression melancholy. He enjoyed a certain amount of fame as the author of lascivious poetry and moral prose. However, after the death of his wife, he gave up his former ways and found a religious vocation, ending his life as a Jesuit. Apart from portraits, Van Dyck also painted other genres to bolster the rich collections of Genoa's citizens. He painted a mythological canvas telling the story of Vertumno and Pomona, taken from Ovid's tale, which was still hanging in Giorgio Doria's palazzo on the Strada Nuova at the end of the 1700s. While love demurely moves away, the god Vertumno, appearing in the form of an old man to win her trust, seduces the nymph Pomona. This canvas too is a portrayal of character through expression. We have the ingenious nymph and the sly god, whose hand is fumbling in her clothes. It is easy to see that Van Dyck was consciously searching for an alternative to Rubens' style, how he was studying Italian painting, especially the work of Venetian and Emilian artists. The results of his search can be seen in the solid structure and sculptural quality of the figures in Christ and the Coin. The Lomellini, who were originally a Lombard family, but who had played an important role in the city's political life since the 12th century, had become immensely wealthy from trading in fish and coral with the Tunisian island of Tabarka, which they had acquired in 1543. Van Dyck had almost automatically made his canvases larger in keeping with the spaciousness of the Genoese palazzi, and painted one of his largest family portraits for the Lomellini Palazzo. The house belonged to Giacomo, who commissioned the portrait. Giacomo was a military man and a high-level diplomat, as well as a hero of the war against the Savoys. Domenico Fiasella, otherwise known as Sarzana, another excellent painter, also decorated the house with religious frescoes, Le Storie Bibliche di Ester e Assuero, during those very years. Lomellini himself was Doge in 1625, and this may be why he doesn't appear in the portrait. Much discussion has been devoted to those who do appear, however. Recent and very valuable research has identified the two small children as Giacomo's children by his second wife, Barbara Spinola, seen in the center of the painting. The two adult men are his sons by his first wife, Violante Pinelli. During his time in Genoa, Van Dyck revealed a talent for painting children which has remained unequaled in the history of painting. He displays a kind of poetic understanding of the world of children, whom he represents with sensitivity and respect, as seen here in his portrait of the three De Franchi children. Some Genoese families chose to renovate their houses in the old town centre rather than move to the new quarter, and it was here that Van Dyck painted Elena Grimaldi, wife of Giacomo Cattaneo, in 1623. The painting has an almost colonial setting. It is aimed more at decoration than introspection, and is a particularly beautiful example of the master's talents. The proud face stands out against the rich red of the parasol and contrasts with the almost humble pose. There is, however, something universal in Van Dyck's minute attention to the microcosm of nature and architecture, as the sign of a conscious civilization which links artist and subject. The extravagant naturalism of the portrait seems to set itself directly against Rubens' stunningly impeccable portraits, such as that of Maria Serra Pallavicino, painted 15 years before in the same city. The Genoese aristocratic oligarchy was quite closed. The city's wealth had come from trade since the foundation of the Republic, but during the Crusades, trade was often entangled with war. The story of the Siege of Lisbon, led by the famous Fernando di Toledo, Duke of Alba, is told in Lazzaro Tavarone's spirited frescoes in the Palazzo Spinola. The ancient practice of contracting out fleets of battleships as a type of maritime mercenary activity had made many Genoese families extremely rich. Part of that great wealth was invested in their wonderful houses, but much more went on loans to mercenaries loyal to Charles V and his Spanish successors. These loans were mainly repaid with the proceeds from American mines. The new wealth was invested in banks such as the historical Bank of St. George, which was one of the largest. The banks in turn financed the popes and all of the reigning dynasties of Europe. Many of Van Dyck's Genoese portraits are of people whose identity has been lost in the mists of time, like this handsome couple, a Genoese senator and a noblewoman who may or may not be his wife. Nameless people who nonetheless contributed in no small way to making our world what it is today. The Genoese Lady with Infant, one of Van Dyck's masterpieces, may be a member of the Spinola family. The subject's natural pose, her exquisite garments and the mobile grace of her face all show how Van Dyck changed the whole concept of portraiture to the point where he even anticipated the first photographic portraits. The Balbys were an extremely rich family of silk merchants who created a whole new street which stretches along the west walls of the medieval part of the city and bears their name to this day. On the street itself, they added 11 family palazzi, a Jesuit college, several monasteries, including the Carmelite one attached to the Church of San Carlo. The picture which Van Dyck dedicated to Giampaolo Balbi had an unhappy fate. Balbi became involved in a plot against the Republic in 1648, many years after it had been painted. He was found out, his family were forced to disown him, and he had to flee the city. The portrait was given to his cousin, Francesco Maria Balbi, who then commissioned the artist Simon de Bois to substitute his disgraced relation's face with his own. This beautiful lady comes from the group of portraits that Van Dyck painted for the Balbys. The pearly skin of her face shines out of a sea of rich brocade. Her expression is such that it may have stayed with the artist for the rest of his life. Van Dyck was an avid traveler and insatiably curious. During his years in Genoa, he traveled widely in Italy. He went to Rome, where Baroque art was highlighting the Counter-Reformation in the Catholic Church. In Florence he witnessed the twilight of mannerism and its lack of great masters. He also visited Turin, Mantua, Milan, Parma, and of course, Venice. He kept a notebook of pen and ink drawings in which he very methodically recorded memories and atmospheres, sometimes accompanied by short notes. His Ages of Man has touches of Giorgione, and as always his beloved Titian, the other great inspiration to his art. Here, Titian's influence can be felt in the airy, dynamic atmosphere infused in an otherwise rather robust northern structure. It is there too in his choice of medium, strong yet transparent colors on canvas, in stark contrast with Rubens' thick enamels and wooden panels. In Rome, Van Dyck moved towards naturalism again as a reaction against too much decorative exaltation, and produced his portrait of Cardinal Guido Bentivoglio of Bologna, a miracle of human and intellectual truth. In 1624, after a bad outbreak of the plague, he left Palermo, where he had been staying as the guest of the Viceroy Emanuele Filiberto of Savoy, and returned to Genoa. He carried with him his grandiose but unfinished work, The Madonna of the Rosary, which he later completed in his workshop. While he was averse to any formal overstatement, Van Dyck here allowed himself to be swept along by the Baroque structure of the many Roman paintings he had seen. He produced a mystical scene full of virtuoso contrasts in color and light, which demonstrates that he had no difficulty with composition, despite accusations to the contrary from some of his Genoese rivals. Between 1626 and 1627, Van Dyck left Genoa and returned to Antwerp. His artistic education was finally complete, and his fame had reached its height. Back in his native city, he painted an altarpiece featuring the Vision of St. Anthony, in which touches of his recent trip to Italy are obvious. For example, the pyramidal composition typical of the Renaissance, and the vivid colors of the Emilian school, which included such artists as Hannibal Carracci and Guido Reni. He was then invited to paint a large and complex piece featuring the ecstasies of St. Augustine for the church of the same name. While it is true that he still used the master's composition, he did bring a certain intensity to his colors, which was very typical of the Italian mannerists. Van Dyck was subsequently appointed painter to the court of Archduchess Isabella. Here again he lived up to his reputation as a great portraitist, with a series of wonderful pictures of various sizes, from his portrait of Tommaso Francesco Savoia Carignano, vice-governor of the Spanish Low Countries, to that of Martin Reichardt, the celebrated landscape artist. The latter is almost impressionist in quality and dominated by the sitter's extravagant red fur-trimmed attire. Van Dyck liked to paint the powerful, and so in 1632 he left Antwerp once more, this time for London, in search of a more prestigious environment in which to exercise his talents. He had already visited the court of King James I the year before his trip to Genoa, but things had changed since then. His restlessness and ambition brought him to the court of Charles I, who, despite the troubled times, was still one of the most powerful men in the world. England was in a state of unrest. Elizabeth I had been dead for almost 30 years, and the Stuarts had since united England, Scotland and Ireland, with much religious and political division over the problem of the divine right of the monarchy. This culminated in an irremediable clash between the Crown and Parliament. After James I, the last English king to reside in the Tower of London, his son Charles I, who succeeded in 1625, made an open attempt to give the Crown absolute power. Charles I was very conscious of the value of cultural prestige and made very clever use of his artists. In fact, Van Dyck's arrival at court was an astute piece of propaganda, arranged by the Earl of Arundel, a family friend of the artist, as well as an influential member of court. Van Dyck was summoned to paint the king and his family, so propagating their images in palaces and royal households all over Europe. Two years previously, Rubens had painted a high-flown allegorical exaltation of the Stuarts in the ceiling panels of Whitehall, a classical Palladian-style building designed for Charles by the architect Inigo Jones. This portrait of the king astride his horse is one of the many Van Dyck painted during his time at court. The king's face is a realistic likeness, but Van Dyck has also managed, through metaphor, to invest his pose with heraldic nobility in his painting of the powerful armor, the proud, impetuous stance of the horse, and the expanse of the landscape rich in architectural references. The portrait of Henrietta, daughter of the King of France, stroking a monkey on the arm of her dwarf, is set against a background of frescoed countryside. The beautiful queen was a source of great misfortune for Charles and the crown. She was Catholic to the point of bigotry, and her faith became fashionable at court, so worsening the religious problems which were sweeping the country. Van Dyck confirmed his talent for painting children in his portrait of Henrietta and Charles's three older offspring. However, history tells us that the king, in a kind of presentiment of the tragedy that was to strike his life, was disturbed by the fact that his oldest son, the future Charles II, was painted wearing childish clothes. The collections of the English royal family, which are partly housed in the 18th century Buckingham Palace and at Windsor, contain a large number of the paintings done by Van Dyck while in England. His beautiful Cupid and Psyche, which anticipated Rococo structure, gives the viewer the idea of the consuming beauty which the artist, influenced by Titian and Rubens, was capable of producing. The warm, luminous sensuality of the nude figures is set against a rustic background dominated by the luxuriant foliage of a tree. In the south of England, not far from Salisbury and its famous Gothic cathedral, was the seat of the Pembrokes, one of the oldest noble families. Of the female members, Mary Herbert, who died in London in 1621, was a writer, translator of Petrarch, and patron of the arts of great intellectual ability. At that time, English culture was still greatly influenced by the humanist courts of Renaissance Italy. The great houses' gardens were filled with fountains and lakes, and must have been the setting for many Arcadian performances and literary pursuits. The largest of Van Dyck's family portraits is kept here. It was painted especially for the house kept by the counts at court, and brought here in 1683 after the Fire of London. The picture celebrates the marriage of Sir Philip Herbert, the 4th Earl of Pembroke's firstborn son, Charles, to Mary, daughter of the Earl of Buckingham. The portrait was a mere formality. The groom's parents had been separated for many years at that point. Tragedy lay in wait for the 15-year-old subject. He was to die of smallpox during a military mission to Tuscany just 1 year later. There is yet another portrait of the king's first 3 children in the same room, and in this one the young prince is finally seen dressed in adult clothes. And another portrait of the king, armed this time and holding the military command baton. Van Dyck must have been disappointed by being forced to paint the same subjects in the same poses again and again, and felt his great talent suffocated. He left for Paris to seek a commission for the Louvre frescoes, but lost out to Poussin and Simon Vouet. He returned to London, where his bitterness was matched by the great tensions rocking the nation. Oliver Cromwell's Puritan Revolution was just around the corner. The much-painted Charles was beheaded just a few years later in front of his own home. His was the first of the royal heads to roll in Europe, but others were soon to follow. But Van Dyck's time was running out too. He died on the 8th of December 1641 at his home in Blackfriars, on the very day that his wife of 2 years, lady-in-waiting to the Queen, Mary Ruthven, had their 8-year-old daughter baptized. Van Dyck was lucky in life, but not in death. His tomb, complete with an epitaph from Charles I, was housed in St. Paul's Cathedral, which was destroyed in the Fire of London in 1666. So removing the last trace of his mortal remains from the earth.